Most Christians today go to church on Sunday. It is a tradition accepted by billions, woven so deeply into the fabric of faith that it feels as old as time itself. But beneath this global practice lies an uncomfortable historical truth. Jesus did not worship on Sunday, and neither did his apostles. If you look closely at the historical record of the New Testament, you will find a completely different story. The Bible plainly tells us that Jesus had a very specific, unwavering custom for worship. Luke 4:16 records, "As his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day." This was not a fleeting habit. It was the foundation of his life. And the apostles? They did the exact same thing long after he was gone. Acts 17:2 reveals that Paul, as his manner was, reasoned from the scriptures for 3 consecutive Sabbaths. So a massive mystery emerges that we cannot ignore. If the founder of Christianity and his closest followers strictly kept the seventh-day Sabbath, how in the world did Sunday become the main day of worship? Did Jesus secretly command this transition? Did the apostles teach it in their final days? Or was this monumental shift engineered centuries later by the power of a Roman emperor and a series of political church councils? This is not simply a religious debate about Saturday versus Sunday. It is the ultimate question of authority. If God established the Sabbath, but the world practices Sunday, we must follow the trail of history to find out who actually changed it, and by what authority they did so. Today, we are going to look beyond the mist of tradition to uncover the history most Christians have never heard. 1. What day did Jesus and the apostles actually keep? Before we investigate the origin of Sunday worship, we need to ask a simple question. What day did Jesus and his apostles actually keep? The New Testament gives us a clear answer. Jesus regularly worshiped on the seventh-day Sabbath. And when he spoke about the future destruction of Jerusalem, he still referred to the Sabbath. Matthew 24:20. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Then, after Jesus was crucified, did his followers immediately switch to Sunday? No, Luke 23:56. And rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. The disciples rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. After the death of Jesus, years later, the Apostle Paul continued the same practice. Acts 17 verse 2. And Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them. 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the scriptures. And notice something important. Paul was not only speaking to Jews, Acts 18:4, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. Even Gentiles were hearing the gospel on the Sabbath. Acts 13:44, and the next Sabbath day came almost the whole city together to hear the word of God. So the biblical pattern is remarkably consistent. Jesus kept the Sabbath. His disciples kept the Sabbath. Paul kept the Sabbath. And Gentiles gathered to hear the gospel on the Sabbath. Yet nowhere does the New Testament record Jesus or the apostles commanding, "The seventh day has been replaced by Sunday." So if Sunday was not introduced by a clear command from Jesus or the apostles, when did Sunday worship actually enter Christianity, and who changed it? That question takes us beyond the New Testament and into the pages of church history. 2. The second century shift, a strategy for survival. If the Bible is so consistently silent on a change, why do we find early Christians gathering on Sunday by the second century? To understand this, we have to stop looking at theology for a moment and start looking at politics and survival. In the second century, the Roman Empire was a dangerous place to be a monotheist. The Romans practiced polytheism and viewed the Jews with intense hatred and suspicion. After 2 bloody Jewish revolts against Rome, the Roman government launched a campaign of brutal taxation and persecution against anything associated with Judaism. Here was the dilemma for the early Christians. To the Romans, Christians looked just like Jews. They both worshipped one God, they both refused to bow to idols, and most importantly, they both kept the seventh-day Sabbath. To avoid being slaughtered alongside the Jews, the church in Rome began a strategic shift. They needed a new identity to show the empire that they were not Jews. Church leaders like Ignatius of Antioch began to frame the Sabbath as Jewish and obsolete, while promoting Sunday as the uniquely Christian day. But why Sunday? This is where the cultural environment of Rome comes in. At that time, a religion called Mithraism was exploding in popularity among the Roman military and elite. They worshipped Mithra, the sun god, and their holy day, Sunday, the day of the sun. By moving their primary worship to Sunday, Christians achieved two goals at once. One, they distanced themselves from the persecuted Jews. Two, they made Christianity more palatable to a Roman society that already revered the sun. By 155 AD, Justin Martyr openly admitted in his first apology that Christians gathered on Sunday. He didn't quote a command from Jesus to do so. Instead, he gave symbolic reasons, calling it the first day of creation and the day of the resurrection. This was the birth of a human tradition. It wasn't a divine decree, it was a compromise born of fear, political pressure, and the desire to survive in a hostile empire. The Sabbath hadn't been changed by God. It was being replaced by men. 3. Why did Christians begin moving away from the Sabbath? To understand the how, we must understand the why. The shift from Sabbath to Sunday wasn't a single event. It was a perfect storm of political, theological, and cultural factors. First, there was the intense political tension. After the Jewish-Roman Wars in AD 70 and 135, the Roman Empire viewed Judaism with extreme hostility. The Romans established the fiscus Judaicus, a heavy tax on anyone practicing the Jewish religion. For Christians, being associated with Judaism was now a death sentence or a financial ruin. Since keeping the seventh-day Sabbath was the most visible sign of being a Jew, many Christians in the West, especially in Rome, began to distance themselves from it for their own survival. Second, there was the theological reinterpretation. Early Christians naturally wanted to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, which occurred on the first day of the week. Over time, church leaders began to frame the Sabbath as a shadow of the old law and promoted Sunday as the Lord's Day, a celebration of victory over death. Finally, we have the Roman cultural context. The Roman world was already deeply immersed in sun worship. Dies Solis, the day of the sun, was a highly popular day in the empire. By moving their worship to Sunday, Christianity became more socially acceptable to a pagan world that already revered the sun. It wasn't that the church simply stole a pagan day, rather, it was a gradual intersection where church tradition met Roman culture, and the biblical Sabbath was left behind in the process. 4. Rome, the Sabbath, and the growing separation from Judaism. As we continue our investigation, we find a massive geographic divide in the early Christian world. The shift from Sabbath to Sunday did not happen everywhere at once. Historical records, including the writings of early historians like Socrates, Scholasticus, and Sozomen, reveal that while the church in Rome and Alexandria moved toward Sunday worship, the rest of the Christian world continued to honor the seventh-day Sabbath for centuries. The church in Rome became the primary advocate for the change. Why? Because Rome was the center of the empire and faced the most intense political pressure to distance itself from the Jewish religion. To make the Sabbath less appealing, the church in Rome introduced a unique practice, the Sabbath fast. While the Eastern churches treated the Sabbath as a day of feasting and joy, Rome commanded its members to fast on Saturday. The goal was simple: make the Sabbath a day of hunger and gloom, while making Sunday a day of feasting and celebration. Church leaders during this era began to use increasingly harsh anti-Judaizing rhetoric. They argued that the Sabbath was a yoke of bondage, and that Christians should show they were part of a new covenant by choosing a different day. This wasn't just a change in worship, it was a systematic effort to erase the Jewish roots of the faith. By the early 4th century, the stage was set. The tradition of Sunday worship was firmly established in the West, but it lacked one thing: legal authority. That was about to change. 321 AD. When Sunday became Roman law. Our investigation now reaches its absolute climax in the early 4th century. Enter Emperor Constantine. Constantine is famous for legalizing Christianity and ending widespread persecution. However, Constantine was also the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of the Roman pagan religion, and a devoted worshipper of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. Constantine saw an opportunity to unite his fractured empire by using religion as the cement. On March 7, 321 AD, Constantine issued a decree that would change history forever. He declared a national day of rest for the empire, but it was not the biblical Sabbath. Here is the exact wording of his law. On the venerable day of the sun, let the magistrates and people residing in cities rest, and let all workshops be closed. Notice what he called it: not the Christian Sabbath, not the Lord's Day, but Dies Solis, the day of the sun. This was a brilliant political move. It satisfied his pagan subjects who worshiped the sun god, and it satisfied the Roman Christians who were already trying to distance themselves from Judaism by gathering on Sunday. The law required judges, city populations, and tradesmen to cease their work. While agriculture was exempted in certain cases, the urban centers of the empire were forced to stop their labor. Here is the most important takeaway from this moment. Constantine did not invent Sunday worship. As we saw earlier, Christians in Rome and Alexandria were already gathering on the first day. What Constantine did was give Sunday a powerful legal status throughout the Roman Empire. 6. From a Christian practice to a church tradition. Now that we have looked at the historical evidence, let's put all the puzzle pieces together into a timeline. How was the Sabbath actually changed to Sunday? When you map it out, you realize it was not a single spontaneous event. First, in the 1st century, we see Jesus, Paul, and the early apostles faithfully keeping the biblical seventh-day Sabbath. Then, moving into the 2nd century, early Christian Sunday gatherings began to appear. This wasn't a biblical command, but a practice fueled by the church in Rome's desire to distance itself from heavily persecuted Judaism. As Sunday became increasingly prominent in the West, we arrive at the 4th century. In 321 AD, Emperor Constantine provided the legal muscle, enforcing Sunday rest by Roman imperial law. Following that, subsequent church regulations officially pushed the Sabbath out, cementing Sunday as the new universal standard. The most important takeaway is this: this was not an overnight change commanded by God in the New Testament. It was a gradual, steady process stretching across hundreds of years. The biblical Sabbath was slowly replaced by a combination of political survival, cultural integration, and human authority, until a simple Christian practice eventually hardened into an undeniable church tradition. 7. Did Jesus ever change the Sabbath? After looking at all this history, the political survival in Rome, the influence of sun worship under Constantine, and the later enforcement by church councils, we must return to where we started, the words of Jesus Christ. Let's look closely at what Jesus said regarding the law. Matthew 5:17 through 18. Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled. Jesus explicitly stated his attitude toward the commandments. Furthermore, when speaking of his authority over the Sabbath, he declared in Mark 2:27-28, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath." He claimed ownership of the Sabbath. He never claimed to abolish it or replace it with another day. When you search the New Testament from beginning to end, you look in vain for a command from Jesus telling his disciples to drop the seventh-day Sabbath and pick up Sunday. The historical record shows us precisely how the change was made, not by divine instruction from the lips of Jesus, but by a long, gradual process of human tradition, political pressure, and church authority. 8. The question you must answer for yourself. As we close our investigation, we are left with the facts. History shows us that Sunday gatherings existed before Emperor Constantine. Constantine did not invent Sunday worship, but the 4th century marked a massive turning point, as Sunday received imperial legal support, and church authorities increasingly opposed and suppressed Sabbath observance. This leaves us with the ultimate question. If Jesus and his apostles kept the Sabbath, and history proves that the change developed gradually after the apostolic age, through political pressure, human compromise, and church decrees, who ultimately changed the day of worship, and by what authority? What do you believe? Did the New Testament actually change the Sabbath, or did church tradition gradually change the practice? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for our next investigation.